I am Tim Wallach, and it was a great pleasure to be the introducer here. Larry Bergreen has done it again. I've gone all over the earth with him, with his exciting books on Magellan, Columbus, and Marco Polo. And now we have the treat of following Francis Drake, who early on in his long career was the most wanted and successful pirate ever to sail. He pillaged for England and himself Spanish galleons laden with New World gold and silver, transforming England in turn from a third-rate island kingdom into a global imperial power. Subsequently, he was secretly dispatched by Queen Elizabeth to circumnavigate the globe, part exploring expedition, part raiding mission, and then called upon to save England from the Spanish Armada. Concerned about an attack by Spain, Elizabeth first sent Drake to Spanish America in 1585 to mount a preemptive strike by looting several ports from the Cape Verde Islands to Colombia, Santo Domingo, and finally St. Augustine in Florida. Then in 1588, as Vice Admiral of the English fleet, Drake attacked the Spanish fleet anchored off the French port of Calais and thwarted Spanish plans to transport an army from the Spanish Netherlands to England. All this and more is in the gripping account In Search of a Kingdom, Francis Drake, Elizabeth I, and the Perilous Birth of the British Empire. I give you Laurence Bergreen.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that beautiful introduction, Tim. Appreciate it.
Please, Larry.
Thank you. All right. I have some slides I want to show you, but first of all, I want to begin in the middle of this journey with something that's specific to the New York Society Library that has to do with the figure who was a big noise in his day named John Dee. John Dee was a mathematician and mystic who had the ear of Queen Elizabeth. He'd been educated at Cambridge University. If we could just bring up the first slide, we'll see how we do that. You'll see him here in black, standing over what looks like a fire. He's burning some kind of a potion while Queen Elizabeth beholds the sight. She regarded him with a certain amount of awe and respect because of his reputed skills in magic. Before he had won this royal appointment, he had been in danger of his life for the very same reasons. The magic is a thread that goes throughout Elizabethan life and Drake's life. In 1570, he was commissioned by Queen Elizabeth to draw up a plan for some sort of British Empire. This seemed like a wild idea because Britain was one of the poorest countries in Europe at that time. People were literally starving in England. The dominant force was Spain. They were controlled the continent and in an alliance with the Catholic Church. Their reach was halfway around the world. England looked like they were about to be overrun at any time. They were torn by great religious dissension. Spain, of course, was entirely Catholic. England was torn between Catholic and Protestant. Elizabeth was on the Protestant side, but the split wasn't as wide as it sounded. But nevertheless, the country was in a dangerous, fragile shape. Dee came along with an idea for uniting it. And, his mystique, Elizabeth, everybody loved to use code words at that time. They always seemed to be play acting. And his code name was 007. And if that number has a familiar ring, it's because it eventually inspired the fictional figure of James Bond in latter-day espionage fiction. But the real or the original 007 was this man on the right standing above the flames. By the way, Francis Drake also had a code name, which was Water, and not surprisingly. Dee had an idea that England could expand from its base And from the way he looked at the world, quite literally, it was ideally suited to do that. From his perspective, England was in the middle of everything and was situated in order to offer a significant challenge to Spain. That made him, along with Queen Elizabeth, perhaps the only one who thought this was possible, because even England and even Elizabeth was very, very wary of Spain. King Philip of Spain was immensely wealthy. Unlike Elizabeth, he was quite reclusive. Spain had far more soldiers, weapons, and resources. They could have invaded England at any time. If they did invade England, they would have come for Queen Elizabeth first. They would have tried her and executed her. So it was one more peril that she faced during her time. Her entire reign was one danger after another. There were at least 14 assassination attempts on her life while she was queen. During that time, gunsmiths learned how to make weapons smaller and smaller, which meant that they were easier and easier to conceal. She managed a few lucky escapes, and other times the plots were foiled before they went too far. But life was uncertain, and it was hazardous. Dee proposed a tract that he wrote called "The Summary of the Commonwealth of Britain," and in this he saw England, or Britain, Great Britain as he called it, and that was the first time that term was used, as the center of an actual empire. And the British Empire then became an idea, at least in Elizabeth's head or in England, but nowhere else in the world. We all know that expression, the sun never sets on the English Empire. However, at this time, in Elizabeth's day, the expression was the sun never sets on the Spanish Empire, because that Spanish Empire had a great global reach, all the way from Spain across to the New World, across part of the Pacific, and it was vast. It was huge. It was sort of collapsing under its weight, but it was omnipresent, and it was much more powerful than England. Dee had a reputation as a mystic, as a necromancer, and he believed in all sorts of signs and significations. And a few years after he came up with this proposal for a British Empire, the Great Comet of 1577 appeared. This was kind of a watershed mark, because for many people, most people in Europe, this was portended doom and disaster and death. Not for Elizabeth. She saw that comet as the beginning of something great, and it was for her the herald of great things to come. As it happened, her favorite, although that's only at that moment, navigator, that was Francis Drake, was beginning his circumnavigation of the globe. That lasted from 1577 to 1580. Drake had come from a very straitened background in Devon, beautiful farmland. He was the oldest of 12 children. His father was a farmer turned clergyman, and most people could not earn their living from the soil there. There were just too many people, and they turned to the sea, and so did Drake. He became an apprentice navigator, learning the merchant marine routes. He served with a cousin who was nobility, minor nobility, named John Hawkins. John Hawkins is notorious because he was one of the first, if not the first, slaver in England. England dabbled in slavery at this time, and some of Drake's early experiences were in slavery. Basically, what that meant was going out with Hawkins and stealing slaves who had already been captured by the Portuguese, which pursued it much more aggressively and methodically, and reselling these slaves. So you could say he was a dealer, a slave reseller. In the process, Drake almost lost his life in some skirmishes in the Caribbean, and he acquired a revulsion against slavery. He did not want to continue being a slaver, no matter how rich he could get. He could become doing it. He decided to go a bit up, one step up, to become a pirate. Now, what pirates at that time, they were different kinds, but they were often supported surreptitiously by a monarch. In Drake's case, Elizabeth gave her blessing, along with others, to some of his voyages, and they stole. Drake particularly wanted to steal gold. That was his animating passion throughout his life. And in England, he's celebrated as navigator, explorer, heroic, etc., etc. But from Drake's point of view, he really just wanted to get gold, and he was obsessed with it from the beginning to the end of his life. It's a remarkable theme that runs through it. And he was very successful at it. He became adept at sneaking up on Spanish settlements wherever he happened to be along the coast of South America, and stealing the gold and getting out of there before Spain did anything. He was helped by the fact that Spain was actually very passive in protecting its empire. And Drake, as far as they were concerned, at least in the early days of his career, was more of a nuisance than anything else. But for Drake, this was a way to get rich quick, which is what he wanted to do. In 1577, he set out from Plymouth, which was near his hometown, in a ship that he later rechristened the Golden Hind, and he sailed across the Atlantic to the east coast of South America and to Brazil. After a while, that became a very common and popular route, but it was quite daring in those days because really disaster had preceded him. The only other person who had circumnavigated the globe, or tried to anyway, before Drake, was Ferdinand Magellan, subject of my earlier book, Over the Edge of the World. Of course, Magellan had perished during the voyage. Most of his crew had perished. He had lost most of his ships, and it was such a disaster that no one attempted to do it again until Drake came along a couple generations later. So if Magellan had demonstrated anything, it was that it was too difficult to circumnavigate the globe, and that it was much bigger and more dangerous than he imagined. Much of the danger had to do with the fact that the Pacific Ocean was so huge. At that time, Europe and all of Europe and England had little knowledge of how big the Pacific was. Of course, it's the largest body of water on the planet. Most of our planet is covered with water. We should call this planet water, not Earth, because so much of it is covered with water. But Europeans didn't know that at that time. And Drake, or before him Magellan, found out to their cost just how big the Pacific was and what an imposing obstacle it was to a circumnavigation. Well, why circumnavigate in the first place? This wasn't like climbing a mountain because it's there. They went for commercial goals. Before this, they had gone in search of spices to China along the spice trail, spice road, and it was a very slow journey. It could take years. The idea was that going over water was supposed to be a shortcut, except the size of the Pacific got in the way. Anyway, Drake wanted to try this, and he, of course, bumped into South America. They were still trying to figure out how big this continent was. There were Spanish encampments on both the east coast, along Brazil, along the west coast, along Chile and Peru and other countries. So wherever he went, he was encountering Spanish forces. They were often very lackadaisical and just let him go about his business. He found very little resistance when he would encounter a Spanish ship. He was also very cautious. He generally stayed offshore. His men would land. They would quickly grab as much gold or gems or anything valuable as they could find and scamper back to their ships and stay offshore again. Drake planned to give most of this, but not all of it, to his sovereign. He always kept some for himself. That was the pirate in him. And even if he was in the thick of the battle, he saved some for himself. This way he became enormously wealthy. And it was not an official or sophisticated armada that he had, unlike Spain. The English Navy at this time was tiny. It was ramshackle. It was mostly privately owned ships. There were a few officers or soldiers in the English Navy, but I would almost put that word in quotes because it was so small and so casual. Spain, on the other hand, it was quite formal. The sailors and officers had uniforms. The ships were brightly and gaily painted, and they were much bigger and they were much clumsier. Although this English, quote, Navy and ships seemed to be smaller and they were race built, but that does not mean racing. It means raised, like lower, R-A-Z-E. They were much more maneuverable, and they could literally sail rings around the big, clumsy, cumbersome Spanish ships. So Drake always had this advantage of being a better sailor throughout the voyage, and Spain couldn't catch him. He also was a vowed hater of Spain. He truly hated Spain throughout his life. However, curiously enough, he was very courtly around any of the Spanish captives that he happened to come across and their captains. He didn't punish them or torture them or hang them or leave them abandoned on desert islands or any of the terrible things that other captains did. When he boarded a ship and cleaned it out of all its valuables, he left a gift, some sort of souvenir, as if to say, Francis Drake was here. And the Spanish were very impressed by his debonair style. Drake was also displayed considerable charm. When he boarded a ship, he would often spend some time with the captain in his quarters. Sometimes the captain would treat him to a meal, and then Drake would rob him. Anyway, he had this courtly style. At the same time, his reputation in Spain, if not England, was growing to almost mythological proportions. It was thought that in Spain that Drake had superpowers, that he had a telescope that could see around the world, and that he had some sort of familiar, which is a creature that accompanies a witch, that would help him in his escapades. So he was widely feared and admired in Spain. And so the legend of Francis Drake first took place in Spain rather than England. There were lots of other explorers and navigators and would-be navigators in England who were vying for Elizabeth's attention. Sir Walter Raleigh, for one, and there were many others. And they were happy to crowd Drake out of the picture for as long as they could. So they weren't about to give him much of a helping hand. And Drake was also discriminated against because of his humble origins. Many of the sailors who went came from noble backgrounds, and Drake was, as I mentioned, the oldest of 12. And I think we should back up now to the beginning in Devon. There's Drake, just so you can see him. But this is perhaps later in life. The oldest of 12, and was even on the voyage when he set out on the circumnavigation. And even though it had the tacit, secret backing of Elizabeth, discriminated against by the nobility on the ship. In particular, a officer named Thomas Doughty. Drake suspected him of practicing witchcraft against him. He considered Doughty a witch. This was a common preoccupation in Elizabethan England. Most witches were women, but not all. They were male witches as well. And Drake considered Thomas Doughty a witch, and decided that he was going to undo or subvert the entire expedition. When they got to the coast of Brazil, he had a trial for Thomas Doughty, and he ordered Doughty to be sentenced to death, to be executed. Oddly enough, this was almost at the same spot where Magellan had faced a mutiny decades earlier and had executed the perpetrator. So now history was repeating itself. It seems kind of unnecessarily or arbitrarily. And yet there was an odd fellowship between Doughty and Drake. There was an account of how they sat down together to break bread before Doughty was executed. And apparently it was cordial. And they were exchanging pleasantries, as incredible as that sounded. But then Doughty was executed. He was beheaded. And Drake set an example for the rest of the crew. It also made him the unchallenged leader of the expedition. At the time he left, there was some question about who was on first, who was really the leader. Was it Drake, or was it the nobleman who had gone along? Now it was clearly Drake, both because of this assertion of his power and because of his formidable navigational skills. Drake knew how to read winds and tides. He was completely fearless. It's incredible to think on this particular circumnavigation that there was almost no loss of life. Magellan had lost almost everybody, but Drake managed to keep everyone safe and sound until the end. And that alone was really a staggering feat, given the fact that they were going from raiding one Spanish settlement after the other. There was another side of Drake besides this bloodthirsty side and that was that Drake was very religious. His father had become a clergyman, and he brought along a clergyman named Francis Fletcher, who kept a rather detailed diary of the voyage. Much of what we know about what happened came from the pen of Francis Fletcher, who was writing on or close to the time of events, which is very helpful. It's been independently published. But even he clashed with Drake, and at one point, Drake condemned Fletcher to death. If you get the idea that Drake had a temper, I think you're right. But then he just basically let him go and said, in effect, only joking, and didn't actually execute him. But he came close, and so his men both respected him, but they were also afraid of him. And Drake himself really only had one loyalty besides gold, and that was to Elizabeth. He claimed he had a letter in his cabin authorizing him to execute anybody who challenged him on her behalf, and to circumnavigate the world. But there's no proof that he did. And it's not even clear when he set out that this was supposed to be a circumnavigation. He could have just gone to Brazil, raided some Spanish settlements, and sailed back to England, or just made his way through the Strait of Magellan. And I want to take you through that to give you some idea. Oh, here's a piece of his instructions, original instructions that was damaged in the fire. Here's his route. You can get some idea of how extraordinary it is. Of course, the furthest south he went was around the southernmost coast of the tip of South America, not quite through the Strait of Magellan, which was the famous shortcut that Magellan had pioneered and was perhaps his chief navigational accomplishment. One of Drake was a good learner. He brought a copy of an earlier account of Magellan's voyage with him, written by Antonio Pigafetta, and followed it. So he learned from Magellan's mistakes about where to go and where not to go. And he was able to capitalize on it. That's part of the reason why this voyage was much safer than his predecessors had been. Just go a little bit further here. I am here aboard a replica of the Golden Hind, which was Drake's ship. It's tied up in London. You can go see it. It's at St. Mary Overy Dock. It's about 100 feet long. And when you think about, which sounds like an impressive size for a ship, but when you think about this ship, along with some smaller tenders, going all the way around the world, it's really incredible to think about. The original ship was lost, but this is considered a fairly faithful replica. Here I am in the Strait of Magellan, which was, the most spectacular waterway that Magellan pioneered, and which proved to be a lifesaver. As you can see, it's beautiful. It looks like a fjord, which it is. It is a fjord. And the weather there is often bad and very turbulent. I happened to be there on a nice day going through. I think in the background, you can see some seals sunning themselves on the beach as they're sleeping there. So some of the scenery was truly spectacular. Curiously enough, Drake was very indifferent to the natural world. He brought back very little in the way of reports about natural phenomena, flora, fauna, heavenly bodies. He was keenly aware of weather. He was really focused on gold. And he learned a little bit about some of the indigenous peoples whom he encountered, and I'll get to that in a minute. But he was remarkably uncurious about, this incredible world and ocean and land masses that he was exploring. Here we see another picture of Drake, the beheading that I mentioned to you of Doughty. This was a depiction of it. And the next one is some sort of a battle. This is a depiction that Drake saw. These were famous engravings by Theodore de Bry, and Europeans at that time, when they imagined what Drake's voyages were like, what Drake's voyage or other voyages at that time, thought about de Bry because they were widely distributed around England and across the continent. And so their mental image of what it must have been like or what it looked like came from Theodore de Bry. Hold on one second here. Here's another engraving of Drake. New Albion was a term that he coined when he sailed along the coast after he came around through the Strait of Magellan and started to sail north. He kept going further and further and further. He sailed along the coast of California and kept going even further up to Washington State and came across a tribe known as the Miwok, M-I-W-O-K. There are just a few of them left. Mostly he was quite concerned about the indigenous peoples, Indians, whom he encountered, because they were used, when they saw anybody who looked European, they assumed they were the Spanish. And the Spanish were coming to kill them. This was the era of the Spanish Inquisition, and they were bloodthirsty and very, very dangerous. So anytime, when Drake encountered indigenous peoples who already had experiences with the Spanish, he avoided them. However, by the time he got to the Miwok, he had gotten so far north that they had not been tainted by these encounters. And they welcomed Drake and his men with open arms. And he spent weeks there at the invitation of the Miwok and was fascinated by the way they lived, by their food, which was mainly acorns, by how they lived, and seemed quite at peace there. In fact, the Miwok were so happy with Drake that they wanted him and his people to stay there and lead them, become their leader. So quite unlike considering him a tyrant or oppressor or anything like that, they thought he was some kind of a leader. It's thought that now that they might have considered him to be the fulfillment of a prophecy, and that's why they offered him this. It's often hard to know what the indigenous peoples whom Drake or Magellan before him encountered, because they did not leave a written record. So we can infer what they did by their behavior or what the Europeans said about them, but we don't have their accounts in their own words, which is unfortunately a big missing gap in the records. So it's sometimes hard to know what they were thinking or why, and sometimes it's pretty obvious. But in other, especially when it becomes concerns their spiritual beliefs, it's you can't really guess. It's hard to know. So there's always going to be sort of a missing pieces of this voyage. Drake continued after he finally took his leave from the Miwok. He headed out into the Pacific Ocean. I think I've said it before. I'll say it again. Largest body of water on the planet. And there he didn't see land for many days. He was experiencing this. It wasn't as terrible as it sounds, because Magellan, and then Drake after him, had discovered the trade winds. These were strong, steady winds that carried his ships pretty rapidly across thousands of miles of ocean, and it was a pretty fast run. So it was, once he got into the swing of things, it was not quite as daunting as it sounds. Eventually, he reached Indonesia. That was the famous Spice Islands that Ternate and Tidor and several others that Magellan had visited, and which had been the point of Magellan's voyage. By the time Drake got there, he was not that interested in their spices, because he had filled up his ships with so much gold that he had stolen from Spain, that he really didn't need the spices. Furthermore, there had been a changing of the guard in the Moluccas. They had welcomed Magellan's people, and Magellan had some, interesting encounters there, and his men, but they were much more indifferent, even hostile to Drake. So, it was not a particularly rewarding or lucrative stop. But again, that he was no longer interested in the spices that the Moluccas had to offer. It was just the precious metals. Here is another image of Drake showing his ship being loaded. A little bit about Drake's physical description. You can see him here. He was fairly short. He was portly, and became even more so as he got older. He had a scar on his left cheek that he had acquired in an early battle at sea, and he had red hair, a very distinctive feature. Some of the pictures show him with brown hair, but his hair was red. That was something he had in common with Queen Elizabeth, who also had red hair. Now we're back to D. And then when Drake finished his circumnavigation, keep in mind, nobody in England knew what had become of him. He had been gone for 3 years, and for all they knew, he had been killed in a shipwreck along the way, or killed by indigenous people, or who knows what. So he did appear off the coast of England, and then sailed right back to Plymouth, where he came from. But he had to stay on his ship, because there was a small case of plague going on, and particularly wanted to see his wife, whom he hadn't seen for 3 years, of course, and he had to wait until the plague relented, and then she finally came on board and saw him, and they had a reunion. There is an iconic image, which is repeated over and over and over, that Drake was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I, except she didn't in reality, and I'll explain why. He did become Sir Francis Drake, but England was still feeling so threatened by Spain that she was afraid that if she knighted Drake herself, that would make England seem like even more of a threat to Spain. And this might push King Philip over the edge, King Philip in Spain, to invade England. So at the last minute, she stepped aside and gave the sword that she used to tap Drake on the shoulder to the French ambassador, and said, "Here, ambassador, you do it." And so the French ambassador stepped in and did it instead of Elizabeth, who could then say that, well, no, she didn't actually knight him. It was somebody else. Elizabeth is, as I'm suggesting here, could be very, very sly, very deceptive, and really, really quite Machiavellian. She became, the older she became, she was a proficient liar. Of course, she had grown up in very difficult circumstances. Imagine your father is Henry VIII to begin with, and your mother is Anne Boleyn. And of course, Henry VIII beheaded Anne Boleyn. That was her beginning. And yet there was also a studious intellectual side of her. She wrote well. She knew Latin. She was far more educated than the average English woman of that era. And her earliest years before she was in the line of succession, she was cloistered and got a fairly good education. Later on, she became much bolder and more daring and deceptive as a monarch, and to maintain a balance of fear. She was called the Virgin Queen. That's an interesting, I think that was more of a sentimental idea than a reality. In fact, she probably did have some lovers, the Earl of Leicester especially, and then a younger one when she was older. We know because they kept visiting her night after night in her chambers, and so it was a kind of an open secret. But of course, she never married. If she had married, she would have lost her power, and or a lot of it, and she would have been subservient to her king, to her husband. People wanted to marry her. One of the most unusual and unlikely ones was the Pope. The Pope thought she was very attractive and spoke openly about marrying her. But of course, that didn't happen. And she wrote some verse about her ambivalence about getting married. At one point, she was engaged to a hunchback who was French, and it's not clear why she picked him. Maybe she thought that she could, be the dominant partner by far with this person who was really impaired. But they broke it off, and it never happened. She continued always to be on her own, and yet seeking fleeting companionship until the end of her life. It was attractive, and you can tell in her earlier paintings, her face was pitted with scars from smallpox, which was very, very common. And she covered it with very, very heavy white makeup that she became sort of famous for, and you see in pictures. Elizabethan hygiene, just as an aside, was pretty primitive. Most people bathed once a year, if that. The royal court bathed about once a month. They tied sachets into their clothes to perfume them, to dampen down the smell. And they didn't have, the toothbrush didn't exist. It hadn't been invented yet. So they had serious and sometimes fatal dental problems, including Elizabeth, and because their teeth, which were rotting in their heads, could cause them a great deal of agony. And that also happened to Elizabeth as well. So dentistry was in it still in a very primitive fashion. So up close, she might not have seemed as desirable as she did from a distance. But anyway, we'll move on. After Drake got back, in addition to knighting him, or having him knighted, she gave him this spectacular castle. Buckland Abbey, which is part of the National Trust and you can visit today, had been a Cistercian monastery. But Henry VIII had claimed it, and then it was adapted for a private home for Drake. His wife, Mary, died not long after he returned. So Drake actually moved in to Buckland Abbey with his very young second wife, who was wealthy and came from the nobility. And he quickly became mayor of Plymouth, a member of Parliament, and had a few other, honorary important functions and responsibilities. And of course, was a knight. He was Sir Francis Drake. Well, it was expected that Drake who was then in his 40s, would have settled down to a very comfortable existence in England. He was now one of the wealthiest men in England, thanks to the gold that he had brought back from his circumnavigation. but he didn't stay there very long. Um, After a few years, he was back again at sea fighting battles, and eventually got involved with the Battle of the Spanish Armada, which I don't think we're going to have time to get to today. I'd like to take some questions instead. He was one of several British explorers and sailors and navigators who participated in it, and perhaps the best known, but certainly not the only one. The importance of the Spanish Armada, just to wrap it up quickly, was that it finally tipped the balance of of power in Europe between Spain and England. After England won that battle, there were several, but they won the first one. Spain was no longer the unchallenged imperial presence in England. England, and in Europe rather, England had arrived and eventually surpassed Spain. But the beginning of the end of the Spanish Empire was the Battle of the Spanish Armada, which of course is in 1588. Drake lived on after that, fought to the end of his days off the coast of Venezuela. It's not really clear why. Instead of staying in Buckland Abbey with his second wife, and died at sea of dysentery, and was buried at sea. No one really knows exactly where his body is. He wasn't even, his exploits weren't even that well known at that time, because I'd mentioned these rival navigators who had suppressed the news of his accomplishments. And there was a chronicler named Hakluyt who put together a book of famous English voyages. The first edition that came out omitted Drake. It's sort of incredible. It was like having an account of astronauts and leaving out John Glenn. The second one, which came out 8 years later, finally included Drake and gave a fairly full account of his accomplishments. So it was only then, rather belatedly, that Drake received the recognition that was his due in England. So that's a little bit about Francis Drake. There's a lot more in the book, and thank you very much for tuning in. It's great to talk with you.
So I see a couple of great questions in the chat, which I'm just going to read aloud to our speaker. Anybody with a question or comment, do drop it in the chat, which is probably to the right of your screen. So question, do you have any sense of what Francis Drake's personal wealth amounted to at the time of his death?
Oh, you mean in current dollars? No, it's very hard to convert gems, the value of gems and gold, to American dollars, but it was one of the largest fortunes in England. What he didn't have was land. He had Buckland Abbey, but he was not a big landowner.
And how much of the gold that he captured went to the English treasury?
A lot of it. When he first arrived, it was a big secret. Elizabeth directed it to the Tower of London, where his ships were kept under lock and key. She denied that he had brought back anything. When people said, "Oh, Drake is back. What did he bring back? He must have brought back gold." She said, No, ships were empty. She was a fluent liar. So it took a long time for the word to get out that he had really brought back a fortune. It was so much. It was more than any other pirate brought back, and it was enough to rescue England. If Drake had failed, if he had never completed this mission, England probably would have gone under. Her treasury was going broke. So he came along in the nick of time.
How was the execution for witchcraft of aristocrat Doughty received by Elizabeth and her advisors upon Drake's
That's a very good question. It was thought that Drake would get into very serious trouble and be tried or even executed or jailed when he got back because of that. However, the Elizabethans, especially Elizabeth, were so happy with the fortune that he brought back, they forgot all about Doughty in the excitement. Now, Doughty had a brother who was there, who kept reminding them, "Hey, wait a second, Drake executed my brother. What are you going to do about it?" But he never really got traction with that.
The gold was a good distraction, I guess. Yes. So something I was interested in, of course, we know that scurvy was really a plague for British sailors and other kinds of sailors.
Yes.
later in history, they went around the world. Was it a big problem for them, or were they able to vary their diet more as they traveled?
I think they vary their diets more. He says very little bit about scurvy, so I can only infer from the absence of in anybody's account about suffering from scurvy that it wasn't a big problem because you can get the vitamin C, the ascorbic acid, to combat scurvy, not just in lemons and citrus fruits, but in beer, in various grasses. There's a lot of different kinds of foods that have it. Magellan's men suffered terribly from it, but we don't really know exactly how much Drake knew about it. But we don't hear anything about these horrible accounts of people's bodies falling apart that we heard from earlier voyages like Magellan.
Interesting. Can you talk a little bit about Drake's manner of gathering gold at his various stops?
Yes, it was very stealthy, and he was very cautious. He did not put himself in harm's way. Drake always wanted to live to fight another day. He was also helped by the fact that the Spaniards were very lazy. So he would come across a Spanish settlement near the shore, and the guards were sleeping, or they weren't there at all. So he and his men would creep up, carry away as many gold bars as they could, put them on a launch and get them back to their ships, and they were gone. Occasionally there was an exception. His largest single haul, which became celebrated, was aboard a ship called Caca Fuego. That was a nickname, Shitfire, and that became the largest haul of his voyage. He encountered that at sea. He gave the captain, one of his trinkets, and they had a cordial meal, and he brought back so much from Caca Fuego that if he had done nothing else, that would have been enough to justify his voyage. So there were different styles, but what Drake was always very careful. He was surgical, if you will, surgical strikes.
So a little different from, I think, my movie image of piracy.
Yes. Yeah. There were other pirates like that, who were more like movie pirates. But Drake had very little, interest in that. And as I said, he was focused on gathering gold. There wasn't too much swagger and, a little bit. I mean, the most Baroque he got was the trial of John Doughty. That was kind of unusual. Drake was not particularly bloodthirsty, but he was basically perfecting these guerrilla missions to steal gold.
So we do have some interest in the Spanish Armada episode in the chat, unsurprisingly. Is there a theory as to why the famous English wind that routed the Armada did not similarly wreck the small raggle-taggle English defenders?
This 1588 was a very unusual year, and it was a very stormy year, and England clearly, the winds favored England. That was just a great piece of luck. There was something known as the LCO, the Little Climactic Optimum, and that lasted, it depends on different accounts, 50 years or 25 years, but it was a period of very stormy, turbulent weather. And Drake happened to, during the Battle of the Spanish Armada, that happened to occur. Nobody predicted it. He wasn't aware of it at the peak of it. So that storm came along and destroyed many of the Spanish ships. This inflicted a huge amount of suffering on the Spanish ships. They had hoped to make a quick getaway and get back to Spain, but they couldn't. Instead, they were blown north all the way around Scotland and all the way around Ireland, and they had to take the long way home. Many sailors died. They were washed up on the coast of Ireland, and sometimes they were treated well, but often they were slaughtered right there when they were washed up on the shore. And they died, in droves. Curiously enough, the ones who did manage to survive and make it back to Spain were well treated by Prince Philip, by King Philip, even though they were in defeat. Drake's men, on the other hand, the victors, when they got back, were left to starve on their ships, and worse than that, they were left to contract diseases. like diphtheria, and many of them died. And there were some discussions about in the English Admiralty about what to do with that, and they were very cold-hearted. I mentioned this in my book. It was thought to be more economically efficient to let them die, so they wouldn't have to pay them. So the victors were actually treated abominably, Drake's men, and the Spanish got better treatment. History's full of ironies.
Wow, yeah, that's disturbing, but very interesting.
Elizabeth was a real skinflint. She really was. Anyway, I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You just mentioned the Admiralty, and we've got a great question here about the founding of the British Navy. How soon after Drake was the British Navy, the way we think of it a little bit later, formed, like Somerset House, HQ of the Navy on the Thames? Also a mention that perhaps Cromwell was actually the father of the British Navy.
Yes, that all came later. There really wasn't a formal British Navy in Drake's day. It was a kind of a pickup, guerrilla operation. That was part of its strength. Spain had a formal navy, but it was very clumsy. The English were very good sailors, and they were very skillful. The fact that it was so irregular actually worked in their favor as they were up and coming.
And what happened to Drake's fortune after he died?
He did not have any heirs. Drake had no children. So it went to various collateral heirs, and England he kept some for himself, but most of it was for England. It went to England to support the crown, which badly needed it. And that's basically what happened to it. There are a few memorabilia or artifacts from his voyage on display at Buckland Abbey and other places. You can also see some artifacts relating to John Dee, the mystic who I had mentioned at the beginning of the talk, at the British Museum. He believed he could see and speak to spirits through a little stone, a little disc about that big called a scrying stone, and there are some of those on display. They're also available online. It's kind of incredible, the things that they believed in. It's really extraordinary.
So we've got a couple of pleasant comments here I'm just going to toss out as representative. Fascinating talk, brought to life the era of Drake, and brought Drake to life. Can't wait to get the book, so I think we can all endorse that sentiment. Someone asks, do you feel like telling us about what you're writing about now, if you are free to do that?
I'm beginning another book. It's about exploration discovery, but it's very different. That's all I can say at this point, but it's completely different.
Great. Well, In Search of a Kingdom is quite new now, so
yes, it just came out a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, it's quite new now, but we will also keep an eye out for future books. So that's all the questions that I see there. Audience members, if there's anything else you'd like to add, feel free to jump in just now. Mr. Bergreen, is there anything else you'd like to add or anything we've left out?
No, I think we kind of covered a lot of bases, but if there's more questions, I'm happy to try to answer.
Well, I might just throw in one more general one. What surprised you in doing the research for this book, given that you had written previous books about explorers and probably were already pretty familiar with Drake's story before you dug into it?
I think what surprised me most about Drake was that, unlike Magellan or other explorers, Drake really had a lot of affinity for the indigenous peoples whom he encountered in his travels around the world. Keep in mind, this was an era of the beginnings of slavery, and that had been his origins. So that was really a very serious, mark against him. But he rather spontaneously, and this happened at least twice, developed an affinity for the people whom he encountered. In Central America, the Cimarron, who were a kind of a lost group, kind of a hybrid, looked to Drake. They wanted him to govern them. They wanted to have their own country and make him their leader. That was rather extraordinary. He could have spent the rest of his career doing that, but he didn't. That was one example. And then the next time, the Miwok, it was pattern similar, repeated itself. I'm not sure what they saw in his behavior or character that inspired that, but it must have been some inborn innate leadership in him, and also a sense that, you know, there was a sort of a sense that he understood them or respected them, or, you know, gave a sense that gave that sense that there was a rapport. So I do think Drake, unlike Magellan, had some personal gifts that were very helpful to him.
Someone comments, it sounds like your research on Magellan enriched your appreciation of Drake.
Oh, I think so. You know, the two of them, I mean, I almost researched the books together because one leads directly to another. I mean, they're very different people, but the Voyages are bookends. And, you know, Drake really managed to do what Magellan couldn't. And after Drake, you know, there were a lot of circumnavigators, and he was the one who finally blazed the path, because, of course, Magellan had gotten killed in you know, along the way in the Philippines. He never completed it, which people forget.
Well, Mr. Bergreen, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Oh, we've got one more light question, but it's a great one. Was there any hint of an affair between Drake and Queen Elizabeth?
Wouldn't that be great? I was hoping if this was the movie version, for sure, but in reality, she would have considered him too much of a commoner. Yes, he became Sir Francis Drake, but her lovers were drawn from the highest echelons of nobility, and Drake did not make the cut.
Thank you. So, Laurence Bergreen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. And thank you. Thanks to everybody. Thank you.